Thank you all so much for coming. We're really excited to start the year off with this panel discussion, looking ahead to what's happening in 2025. Before I begin, just a couple of quick things. One, please do be sure to silence your phones. And I also wanted to remind you to keep an eye on the many events that we have coming up here at the FCC, including a club dinner tomorrow, which is also a panel discussion. It's called Connecting with Hong Kong's History Through Innovative Technologies, and it's about how cutting-edge technology and community engagement are shaping the methodology and narrative of historical preservation in Hong Kong. This ties in with our excellent wall exhibition that we have downstairs about Hong Kong's ghost signs, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already. It's been running all month. So yes, that's tomorrow night, club dinner, and the first of many events to come. So please keep an eye on your emails. But for today, we're talking about 2025, and we have a sold-out crowd today, which I'm really happy to see. It also makes me wonder if people are maybe feeling a little bit nervous about what's coming this year. But fortunately, we have an excellent panel of speakers here today to help us prepare. So starting from the end here, we have Juliana Liu, who is Senior Editor for Business at CNN International, where she leads coverage of the Asia-Pacific region, focusing on the global economy and markets, technology, consumer brands, and media. She's also a former president here at the FCC. In the middle, we have Wang Xiangwei, a veteran journalist who many of you will know as the former editor-in-chief of the South China Morning Post from 2012 to 2016 and editorial advisor from 2016 to 2022. He's recognized as one of Asia's leading commentators on China and its international relations, and he currently teaches journalism at Hong Kong Baptist University. And sitting next to me, we have Michael Boserque, a global affairs analyst and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, who has been based in Ukraine since before the Russian invasion in February 2022, almost 3 years ago. He is a frequent guest on the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, and other global media outlets. So we have a lot to talk about, and we'd like to leave time for some Q&A at the end, so please do think about questions you might want to ask. But Michael, I'll start with you. Could you just give us a brief overview of some of the events on the calendar this year, or what else is going on in terms of major events to watch?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, and it's good to be back home at the FCC. I was a member here when I worked for the SMP, and including when we crossed the harbor to start Eastern Express, and I see a couple of faces from that era, Anna and Chris. Those were, by the way, times when we had so many reporters making big news here. Reporters who had just trekked out of the Myanmar jungles recently were searching for the Marcos billions, and they would come into the club and tell their stories. But lots to talk about from the past year. In fact, I think the word head spinning doesn't even include everything that's happened over the past year. But one of the defining terms of last year was it was the Super Bowl of elections. I think the number I recorded here was 40 in all, meaning that almost half of the world's population went to the polls to vote in democratic elections and perhaps not so democratic elections. But we had the big ones, Russia, South Africa, India, UK, USA, of course, which we'll be talking about, Iran. And then closer to the end of the year, we had interesting shifts in places we did not expect. Moldova, near me in Ukraine, the incumbent president barely squeaked through, and that was mostly because of the diaspora vote. And the same thing happened pretty much for the referendum on EU membership. That hardly squeaked through. And then they're going to have parliamentary elections in the next few weeks. It's going to be a tough one. Of course, then there's Georgia as well, where a Moscow-friendly administration has come in. And then finally, the only other one I'll single out, because we're going to see a rerun very shortly, is Romania. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about technology, but it played a big role there. TikTok reportedly supported by Russian funding and skills, led to a relatively unknown chap who also was one of the few who got in last year, who admires Mr. Putin. So lots of nervousness over that. And then I covered the BRICS summit in South Africa almost 2 years ago, and we're seeing interesting shifts there, expansion of membership. Of course, this is the bloc that sees itself as kind of a counterbalance to the rules-based international order, started, of course, by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Indonesia has just become a member, adding to a few others, including those who have money, like the UAE, and including bad actors like Iran. I think last year also is a year, and we're going to see it more this year, where we saw autocrats, I think, operating with much, much more impunity. And I think what we see as well is a lot of autocrats watching each other, especially someone like Mr. Putin, who day after day after day, including today, I just received air raid siren alerts from Ukraine, is testing how far he can go, not only Ukraine, but also into what we regard as NATO territory. Russian missiles and drones transiting NATO territory. And that's above and beyond the other more nefarious things that are happening, which is causing a lot of nervousness in Washington. Things like spreading the war into possibly North America. And what I mean by that is, for example, right now, if New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporting by others are to be believed, smuggling electronics on board cargo aircraft to see whether they'll explode, how long it takes to explode. And now there's nervousness in Washington that these may be smuggled onto an airplane headed for the US and will have a horrible, catastrophic mid-air disaster. Finally, we have to, of course, because it's overarching everything, is climate change. We see what's happening in California right now, and while we may be surprised at the scale of it, we shouldn't be surprised that this is happening. This is a recurring event. I just recently sold my place in Vancouver Island, which is described as paradise by many Canadians, and a big reason for that was the climate change. We're getting smoke every year, every summer, from internal British Columbia, but also Oregon and Washington State. And what we're seeing now is double displaced people. We have seen displaced people, large populations, by conflict, but now we're seeing it by war and insecurity. And I'll end on one quick anecdote. My good friend Daisy Suarez is a resident of Altadena. They just lost their home, their entire home, life savings pretty much. She's someone who started out with almost nothing, got married, then they moved to downtown LA. They moved out of downtown LA because of the insecurity there. A lot of homelessness, sirens, and then there were those big protests, tear gas, and that was a red line for them. So they decided, let's move to the hills, to a more quiet area, and now they've just lost that too, and they don't know where to go. So I think, to end on that, we're going to see also shifts of populations to what's seen as safer areas, but also areas where it's regarded climate is not such a big factor. So perhaps more to extreme northern hemispheres, extreme southern hemispheres, and that's going to also impact on tourism as well. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned the U.S. election, and I think the one event that we're all looking ahead to in the coming days is the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term as president. Xiangwei, you, back in December, it was reported that President-elect Trump had invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to his inauguration, which is highly unusual, and he's very unlikely to actually go. But you wrote a column recently saying that he should go. Why is that, and how do you think China is perceiving the incoming administration?
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for having me back. Great to be back. It's been a really busy couple of weeks because I've been invited to speak at various forums. Just yesterday morning, I was at the panel on China-U.S. relationship at the Goldman Sachs Macro Global Conference in Four Seasons. Like the Four Seasons Grand Ballroom, like 2,000 investment professionals just at the time when I started to talk about why China did a terrible job of explaining itself to the outside world, the fire alarm started. And I just immediately said, I will moderate and then the fire alarm stopped. And so we continued. That panel, me and Jude Blanchard, one of the leading scholars in the United States on China. I guess, I'll start with Biden, then I'll talk about Trump. Because, it sounds like a long time ago. In fact, 4 years ago, before Biden came to office, he always boasted the fact that he spent more time with our leader more than any other leader. In fact, he said he traveled 17,000 miles together with our great leader up north when they were both vice presidents. So he gave sort of impression he knew how to handle China. And look at what happened over the past 4 years. Instead of putting China-US relationship on the less perilous footing, in fact, China-US relationship has deteriorated sharply. I mean, I guess, sort of Biden could argue that the fact that the leader, the China's leader he used to knew, is no longer the man he knows. But still the fact remains that the sort of bilateral relationship has sort of deteriorated on all fronts. And Biden ended up being the first president, US president, who did not visit China since Ronald Reagan in 1984. And then at the end of his office, it's very interesting, then he started to boast on another fact which is related to China. And he said that when he came to office, there were a lot of talk about China inevitably is going to surpass the United States. And now he's boasting nowadays, saying that there were little talk of that. So every time I hear that, I'll sort of smile to myself. It had nothing to do with the United States. China did that to himself. China's economic slowdown is mainly caused by self-inflicted mistakes. Now come to Trump. Again, let's put this into perspective. During Trump's first term in office, some of the China's nationalists relished calling him 川建国 in Chinese, means Trump, the nation builder, meaning that his presidency would undermine US international influence and would in turn bolster China's global standing. Now, just days away before Trump assumes his second term, and if you go through the China's internet, there's literally no talk about Trump being the nation builder for China again. And in fact, over the past few weeks, the People's Daily, the flagship newspaper of the Communist Party, have printed several very friendly commentaries, urging China and the US to work together over trade, over everything else, and technology. I think the fact that there were few mention of Trump being the nation builder for China is that, as I mentioned earlier, China's economy, the US economy has emerged much stronger out of the chaotic pandemic era, while China is facing very strong economic headwinds. And then sort of moving forward, as Jennifer mentioned, that some of you may have read, I wrote a column a couple of weeks ago suggesting that our president should take up the offer and go to Washington. And now in the end, he did not take up my suggestion. Probably he's going to send his vice president. But still, I still hold on to this view. I think it's a great opportunity that China missed. I mean, because right now we have come to a point that both countries should really, the two leaders should really meet as soon as possible to avert another war over trade, and then to talk about how the two countries could really seek a durable coexistence. And I think we're probably going to discuss about this later. I think eventually it will come to a point where whether the world can allow two systems to coexist at the same time. Right now, there has been no consensus. I mean, the US is determined that the system that China wants to advocate to disappear. And then I'll leave this with you as something to think about. Over the past 10 years, ever since Xi Jinping came to power, the predominant theme in the Western media is China is being assertive, aggressive in international affairs, which is partially true. But then again, I think mostly China is playing defense. Let me give you an example. That in November, when Biden and Xi Jinping met last time in Peru, China finally drew the 4 red lines for the United States. One is Taiwan. The second one is democracy and human rights. Third one is development path and system. Fourth is the rights to development. If you look at the 4 issues, it's not that China wanted to export its ideas and models to the outside world. China seriously, the Taiwan issue aside, China is seriously concerned its own system being subverted by outside influence. I mean, that's why they draw these red lines. It's all about they want to defend their own system, path, whether you like them or not. I think, if we talk about China-US relationship, I think it boils down to this point I want to emphasize again. Whether over the next 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, even 10 years, whether a new equilibrium will be reached where that the China and the US will reach agreement where they will allow the two systems to coexist. They will find some durable ways to have the two systems coexist. Before that equilibrium is reached, we'll continue to see lots of ups and downs in the years ahead. That's my pitch.
Thank you. Juliana, is this still on? No?
We can hear you. I think we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, I'll try this one. Juliana, I wanted to ask you more about the Chinese economy, which has struggled to recover from the pandemic, especially compared to the US economy. And of course, both under the Biden administration and presumably under the Trump administration, there will continue to be tariffs and export controls and other restrictions on investment that China says is constraining its development. I think on Monday, Biden just announced new AI chip controls. Do you think the Chinese economy will be able to turn around at all in 2025, or will it continue to be?
So I think that's a very tough question.
Okay.
I'm not optimistic about that. The main themes of our coverage, the things I'm really thinking. Oh. No, I think it's working. I think it's maybe just. Okay, is this better? Okay. So I think those are the big themes of this year. I'm not very optimistic about the Chinese economy recovering in 2025. For the last 4 years, we've seen really a dual speed economy that's really bifurcated. So we're seeing massive trade, particularly exports. China's factories are massively humming, producing things. Even so, there is still a lot of overcapacity. Xiangwei, you're talking about Goldman Sachs, and their estimates are that on the auto side of things, only around 50 to 60% of that capacity is even being utilized at a time where enormous shipments of cars are flooding the world, creating lots of trade tension with partners like EU and the US, while at the same time, consumption is at a slump. I mean, Barclays has really eye-popping data on this, estimating that because of what's happened in the property sector, $18 trillion worth of wealth was lost. That's equivalent to China. So China just lost China in the last few years. When so much of people's wealth is concentrated in their homes, so they've lost huge amounts of their net worth or their notional net worth. And what's happened is, even though people still have enormous savings, and in fact, savings are going up, people simply aren't spending. So we're seeing retail sales really struggling to recover. We're seeing consumer confidence at record lows. And also, this is the first generation since 1978 where younger people are not expecting to do better than their parents. This is a real problem in China. And I don't see that being turned around in 2025. It very much feels like the leadership will do basically the bare minimum to meet that 5% GDP. So if anyone's wondering, that is probably the, that's the forecast. And tomorrow we're getting GDP figures for 2024 and the quarter as well. I'm sure that 5% will be reached. I mean, the president has already talked about that. So we're pretty sure that's gonna happen. But that doesn't signify that the economy is doing well at all. So that kind of dual track, dual speed economy, which is causing problems not just within China, but with its partners around the world, is a massive problem this year. In addition, the US-China tech war, which, thank God, so far is still a cold war, it's not a hot war. But I think anyone in the space will know that this is massively consequential. Computer chips are the oil and gas and gold of our age. And on Monday, that's what I was covering. I was covering the latest round of chip curbs, the parting shot by the Biden administration. I think it's the 4th or the 5th round, depending on how you count. And this one is probably the most consequential because China is not even directly addressed. What they actually did was they were addressing, most of the world. They weren't addressing US's closest allies, though they pretty much have unfettered access to AI chips, which again, if chips are the lifeblood of our economy, AI is where the future is. So friends of the US get unfettered access. So-called adversaries or arms embargoed adversaries, heavily restricted. No actual change in actuality. But for most of the world, this is the 100+ countries that this mostly affects. There are now going to be restrictions on GPU, restrictions on what they're allowed to buy. Of course, if they sign up to certain security guarantees, then they can buy more. But this is very clear. This is intended to keep these chips outside the hands of China and Russia. So how this evolves, whether Trump will continue that, it's unlikely to see that he will not continue that, is something that is going to be something we continue to cover a lot. And of course, the tariffs, right? We're talking about just days before Trump takes office. He's threatening 60% at least on China, 25% on even friendly, strong allies. And will he go ahead with that? Is it going to be even more? Is it going to be 100%? And what is the impact? What is the response from China? Ironically, the tougher Trump is on China, the more likely that the leadership is going to pull its socks up, possibly, and actually do something to put money into the hands of real people, which is where we actually really need to see the economy growing. It's not on the building stuff for export or even potentially building stuff for export that don't find homes, as we've seen in some places. So those are the main themes that we're working on, and those are of real concern.
Did you want to add?
I just want to follow up on what Juliana said about the fact that more pressure from Trump actually will give the external push to China's leadership to restructure its economy. I recently wrote something about this on SCMP as well. So I want to share this with you is because I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than Juliana is because I believe that China has been backed into a corner. So China will have to do something very quickly. And then Donald Trump is going to match the nickname that China's nationalists have given him, being the nation builder for China. Just allow me a few minutes to explain. Because over the past 40 years, China's economic growth has mainly relied on two traditional growth engines. One is infrastructure investment, the other one is exports. And now, China's infrastructure investments have long peaked. China has built the world's longest high-speed railways. The length of China's high-speed railway is longer than the rest of the world combined. And China has world-class highways, airports, you name it. And then the returns, the ROE, the returns on infrastructure investment is getting smaller and smaller. And then the exports. Over the past 40 years, exports have been is the engine of the growth. And then for the past 2024, China's exports notched another record. Is because all the exporters would try to rush the stuff to the international market before Trump comes to office. So it's safe to say that export for China this year and in the next 4 years are going to be very bleak, not only because of the tariff from US and also because of the rising tensions between China and the EU, another of China's major trading partners. So then it leads China to the only other engine of growth, which is domestic consumption. China, over the past 40 years, China's leadership have been saying this publicly, oh, they're going to boost domestic consumption. However, domestic consumption has always remained a low priority compared to infrastructure investment and exports. The main reason is because they have relied on these two growth engines too comfortably for too long. They don't want to get off these two engines. But I think those two engines have already stalled, and they're going probably even more so in the next few years. So they will have to do something more than providing subsidies for households to upgrade their electrical appliances. The key thing is, if you boost domestic consumption, you have to place money in the hands of people. And over the past week, the Chinese government sort of quietly started to do that. All of a sudden, they raised the salaries for civil servants and the public sector workers the first time in 10 years. And why it was quiet? I guess those bureaucrats felt ashamed to raise the salaries for themselves before they consider raising the pension funds and the social securities for the ordinary folks. I think this is what China is going to do, that China is planning a bigger hike in pension funds and social security contributions with the plan to be approved in the coming annual session of NPC. I think, and then exactly how much China is going to do this, and then we have to rely on Donald Trump. So this is the perverse logic I want to share with you. The harder the U.S. sanctions on China, the faster China will act to stimulate its economy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll have lots of news in the first days of the Trump administration in terms of tariffs and other actions being taken that will be able to let us test this theory early.
Well, Jen, it started as soon as he was elected.
Yeah,
the
that's
election,
true.
the headlines started coming in, weeks ago.
And yeah, they're not going to stop. So we'll come back to China, but I wanted to shift over to the other side of the world where they're certainly not the only conflicts happening in the world, but they're the two major ones that are getting the most attention. Gaza and Ukraine. There's talk this week again of a possible ceasefire in Gaza. And I wanted to ask Michael, what are the prospects for either of these conflicts to be resolved this year? And what would that look like?
Thank you for that. Well, in a word, ain't looking good. I think in the past 24, 48 hours, we've come as close as we have to the two sides getting together over the Gaza conflict to reach a ceasefire deal or a cessation of hostilities, whatever you want to call it. But I served for UNICEF for almost 3 years in the West Bank and Gaza. I know that area very well. And I came back to spend most of my time in Israel when I came back to that region a few weeks after the Gaza war started. And I will just repeat to you what every single Israeli I met with told me, guy on the street or experts or people from Haaretz newspaper, is that the one person who does not want peace to happen is Benjamin Netanyahu. And reason for that, he shares some things with Donald Trump, is that as long as this continues, it will keep him and his wife out of prison for the massive corruption schemes that they cooked up over the years. Having said that, the U.S. is providing unbelievable amount of military aid, financial aid to Israel. As someone who's worked a long time in the humanitarian aid business, I think what's happening in Gaza, we've never seen anywhere else in the world on this scale. And what worries me in the longer term, and many, many others, is that the world will look the other way or close its eyes to this kind of massive, massive suffering. I will remind you that the Gaza Strip is very typical to many other bordering nations in that part of the world where almost 50% of the population is 18 and under. And I also tell you something that I said to Israeli television a couple of years back, is that what is happening right now is you are encouraging all of these young people who were doing the right thing, going to their school, listening to their parents, studying hard, wanting to go abroad. You're turning them into potential radical members of this population. How are you supposed to fix it? How are you supposed to fix it when you're a 10-year-old and your home has been destroyed, your parents are gone, everyone close to you is gone? How are you supposed to fix that in your head and go on normally? So I hope that, of course, peace will come soon to the region, including to Lebanon, which has been heavily hit. And I think the very active participation of the Gulf states gives us some more reason for hope. And I think also we have to hope that the Gulf states take a little bit more creative approaches to helping the people of Gaza. What I mean by that is a lot of them have no means to survive economically. I know it's a sensitive issue among the Palestinians, but for a lot of working age people, their only option for work is going to the Gulf states temporarily and being hired to build these massive multi-billion-dollar projects and then send the money back. That will help alleviate some suffering. To Ukraine, you probably saw that Ukraine had one of its most massive, widespread strikes within the Russian territory over the past 24, 48 hours, a mix of US-supplied missiles and drones. Part of the targeted area was the Engels Air Force Base, or where that is located, the very, very place where the huge Russian bombers take off and fire missiles into civilian areas in Ukraine. This has been a target that has been long in the bullseyes of the Ukrainians. And now, through new technology, they're able to do that type of things. And, it's got to be said, you can't blame the Ukrainians at this point for wanting to bring the war to the doorsteps of ordinary Russians. But I'm going to point, and of course what's happening, in fact, I just got an air raid siren alert for Lviv in Western Ukraine, the last place I was in Ukraine before coming here, was the Russians will retaliate. And they will retaliate hard. The fear is right now is that in the crazy headspace of Mr. Putin, that he's going to order more firing of the Oreshnik missiles. The one that hit Dnipro a few weeks ago with incredible devastation, the one that he said travels at something like 3 or 4 kilometers a second, the one that he said when it explodes, the temperature created on the ground rivals the temperature on the sun. It's massively destructive, and he's talked about launching 3 at once. One more quick point on this tit for tat, if we want to call it that, is the Ukrainians, including the past 24 to 48 hours, have not struck at civilian targets in any way the way the Russians have. No apartment buildings struck, no churches, museums, that sort of thing. It's a very, very important distinction to make. Now, one last point on this, because I don't want to take up too much time on the conflict I'm most familiar with, but Mr. Trump, you'll recall, promised to bring peace to that part of the world within 24 hours, either of being elected or of his inauguration, but now that's been expanded, I think, to about 6 months. I think what will happen there is he will probably meet with Mr. Putin, but I think Mr. Putin has his mind made up. He has seen what he's able to get away with. He has seen firsthand the weakness of NATO. He's seen the way the Russians have able to wage their hybrid war all over Europe. And he's also seen some of the political shifts that I talked about earlier in the European political space. So I don't think he's prepared for any peace settlement, but if they do get to that discussion across the table, I think the Ukrainians will be there. He will insist on holding on to what they have, in other words, Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. He will probably say we want Zaporizhia and Kherson as well, and I'll remind you that Zaporizhia is where Europe's biggest nuclear reactor is located, which is now in their occupied lands. They're also probably going to ask for a demilitarized zone, and then finally something which Ukraine will never agree to is to drop its NATO bid. I don't think any of us would want to be President Zelensky right now, because when you are pressured, as he is right now, to go to the negotiating table and say this is what's going to happen, and that's the growing feeling in Ukraine right now, is that Ukraine, after having spilt all of this blood, the Ukrainians saying to themselves, why did we spill all this blood? We're not only defending our own homeland, we feel that we're defending Europe as well and the advance of Mr. Putin. It's going to be very difficult for Mr. Zelensky to sign off on giving away territory. Crimea, I think most Ukrainians will agree, is gone for good. But it's really those 2 other oblasts, Zaporizhia and Kherson, which are very, very sensitive. Aside from it being home, of course, to many Ukrainians who will never, ever agree to living under Russian occupation. They say living in hell is better than living under Russian occupation, but there's a lot of mineral and other resources in those areas that the Russians badly want, and they're going to try very hard militarily and also politically and diplomatically to hang on to that.
I have a lot more questions, but I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience as well. So why don't we take a couple of those? Please raise your hand and we'll come around with a microphone. Anna, do you want to start?
Okay. I think it's emerged this week more publicly than before. Sorry, Anna Fenton, former president of the club. The shadow fleet that Putin is operating of rusting oil tankers around the world, which are now presenting a serious global pollution hazard. Biden's done nothing about it. President Xi, who is equally affected, has done nothing about it. What would it take for the global leaders to do something, or is Putin really running the world?
Well, it's a great question, Anna. I think what this shows is the weakness of European leadership, of NATO leadership. What it does do is it wakes up the capitals, the Baltics, Finland, Norway, those bordering states where this is happening. And this is happening with such audaciousness. They're not taking much care to hide these activities. And what I mean is, for example, these old boats from wherever that Russia has hired that turn off their transmitter and drag their anchors and sever submarine cables. The other thing that's happening is, this shuttle fleet of oil tankers that are going through various huge bodies of water. I regularly, in my walks on Odessa, I walk by the coast of the Black Sea. Normal times, I would count maybe 12 ships there waiting to be loaded with grain to take to the world. And then I go on maritimetraffic.org or whatever and see what's going on in other parts of the Black Sea. And it's all traffic coming out of Russia. A lot of oil going through the Bosphorus Straits to world markets. And then some of you may have seen yesterday really great FT reporting on how European shipyards, guess what? Well, they're helping to repair and maintain a lot of these ships that are transporting sanctioned items. So I think the Europeans, and you have, a pretty new team now in Brussels, including the former Prime Minister of Estonia, who knows the Putin mentality very, very well. I think they're going to look at new ways of sanctioning Russia. But we have to remind everyone that there's a huge problem with sanctions. A lot of them only have a shelf life of 12 to 16 months if you're lucky. Various governments and non-state actors and commercial entities, some big ones, have become very adept at finding ways around. I'll give you a quick example. All of a sudden, guess what? Gabon has become a major exporter of aviation parts. 1.5 billion, I think, in 1 year. They didn't have that 2 years ago. Why? Because they're a new transit route for aviation parts smuggled from the West to Russia. Same thing for Thailand as well. Huge amounts. And I think recently the US Treasury Department has sanctioned some entities right here in Hong Kong, shell companies, for enabling Russia to move its stuff. So to end that answer, I've always said from the very, very beginning, the only way to really get at Putin and his circle with Western sanctions is to tighten the noose around the people around him, the oligarchs. Because when it comes to the point where the only place they can vacation is perhaps Pyongyang or the new islands in the South China Sea that are being created, or the only areas they can buy property are very restricted, that's when they're going to feel it, and then they'll put pressure on Mr. Putin to fix it. But it's sad because I think we're running out of tools in a way to really make it more difficult for the Russians to export, to bring their stuff in. Finally, the Ukrainians have basically done away with very little capability, no Russian navy, no navy to speak of. They've done away with a huge part of the Black Sea fleet using technology, sea drones and that sort of thing. So they're also feeling that it's being left up to them to put Putin and the Russians in their place.
Ms. Lau in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Emily Lau of the Democratic Party, and thank you for the briefing on Ukraine and Gaza and China. But since we are in Hong Kong, and I think many people in this room and maybe outside are quite pessimistic about this city's future. So especially if it's now so dependent on mainland China. Would the panel like to tell us what you think about the future of Hong Kong, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. She warned me before I got on the stage. She wanted to ask some tough questions. I'll be happy to share my thoughts, and my fellow speakers here will share theirs. I think, Hong Kong is, obviously, as Emily said, is going through a very difficult patch and is going to be even harder this year, because I believe as soon as the court in Hong Kong announces the verdicts on Jimmy Lai, I think the United States and EU will impose sanctions on Hong Kong. How hard? We have no idea. And the second point I want to make is this: that as we move along, that Hong Kong is going to become a political football to be kicked around by whoever who wants to kick Hong Kong. And the third point I want to make is this: I hope there won't be any fire alarm. That I think, I have said this so many times publicly and privately, that China has done a terrible job of explaining to itself, to the outside world, because of its own system, because of all the reasons we can understand. But the thing is, the Hong Kong government is doing an even worse job of explaining itself to the outside world. I mean, in China, we can understand. It's a one-party democracy. They do propaganda. But Hong Kong, what's that slogan? The world city. And, we are, but then again, if you look at, what is Hong Kong government? Hong Kong government has a sort of government information service. Where is GIS? And then where is the coordination? On Monday, they started this Asian Financial Forum. And then on the same day, the Security Bureau announced the brief detaining of Robert Chung, the former Hong Kong U opinion poster. I think that's one thing. The second thing is, I wrote about this as soon as I came back to Hong Kong at the end of 2022, and I also talk about this on Emily Lau's podcast, which is that, I believe that Beijing wants Hong Kong to remain as a capitalist city. The biggest danger for Hong Kong is, right now, certain people in Hong Kong, I'm talking about the elites, they have started to adopt the mainland style lingo, language, posture, words, worsening the impression that Hong Kong is sort of going towards one country, one system. I have very strong opinions about this, and I think for Hong Kong to do better, Hong Kong will have to do a much better job of defining itself to Beijing, to people in Hong Kong, and to the international community, to Beijing. I think Hong Kong, there has to be two-way communications instead of just one-way communication of people in Hong Kong listening to whatever Beijing says. The Hong Kong people here need to go up to Beijing and convince the leadership what needs to be done to keep Hong Kong as a separate city. And then Hong Kong also needs to do a much better job of going to its major trading partners, including Europe and the United States. I know for a fact the US has sanctioned certain officials in Hong Kong, but what about those officials who are not sanctioned? They should go up and try to craft a new narrative for Hong Kong. Right now, I don't see that. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic. Blame Emily as she started.
Yeah, just to add to that, Xiang Wei puts things very well into a global macro perspective, and we're all feeling the chill in some way of that. I think what I want to add is that on an individual level, For me personally, some of the patterns are even more concerning. That Hong Kongers are no longer spending their money and their time in the city. They're going across the border. I mean, I would like to do that too. It's a little bit tricky for me, but what we're seeing those things take place. I'm a big shopper on Hong Kong TV Mall. I have a big family. I buy a lot from them, and I have been getting letters from vendors on Hong Kong TV Mall asking me to support them rather than to go over across the border and shop at Costco or Sam's or wherever people are going these days. I think there's a lot that we can still do to support Hong Kong businesses, supporting the club, supporting the F&B industry in the city. I think those are all things that we can do. Despite all the things, all the kind of macro pressures that we are inevitably facing. As for CNN, we're very committed to staying here and to growing. We've seen enormous growth in our bureau, including US desks, entire desks covering the US from Hong Kong during US overnight hours. So I can say that we're all still very committed to this place, and I hope we can all do our part to try to make sure that Hong Kong stays a global, not just financial center, but a global consumption, retail, shopping, a place where people can go to the movies instead of going to the border, going across the border. I hope we can all support that.
Emily, I remember standing at the bar at the FCC. I think you were at Far Eastern Economic Review at the time, and you encouraged me, put it in your story, put it in your story. So you were part of my growth as a reporter. I thank you for that. I used to work for a chap called Kun Pansak. He was the editor of Asia Times in Bangkok. And he would spend weeks and weeks and weeks before we launched the newspaper in this kind of gentle indoctrination of how to cover Asia. And for example, he said, he nicknamed me Barbecue. I have no idea why. And my name rhymes with barbecue. He said, Barbecue, I want you to go to Singapore and you cover Lee Kuan Yew as hard as you can. Write about him, but don't you dare get kicked out. Don't let them expire your visa. You have to know how far you can push. And the reason we could do that is because we knew where the red lines were in Singapore in those days. And I think the same thing has to happen here. If Hong Kong wants to retain its status as a media center, a center for creative industries, gray lines don't work for us, those of us who work in this business. We have to know what we can report. And the last time I checked, business relies a lot on reliable information, free flow of information. So, the SCMP business section was the go-to place. Asia Week, or Far Eastern Economic Review as well when they were around. So I think the Hong Kong authorities need to be reminded of how this also reaps economic benefits. And then very, very quickly, having not lived here for a long time, coming back, I will say one positive thing about Hong Kong. I think it's become much more user-friendly, human-friendly, a better place for people to walk, to run, and pursue physical activities. But there are other things that you've already talked about that have not gone that route.
We do need to wrap up, but I think we have time for one more question. Or I might just wrap up with my own question. Yes, over here. This will be the last question. And also, I'll just wrap mine in with that, which is to ask you all briefly, what is one thing you hope will happen in 2025, and how likely do you think that is? But please go ahead.
Okay. I have a broader questions regarding this two global system. So, as there was told before that China is kind of defending their own system, and then the other system, which have been actually longer system. And my point is like there is a private land ownership, because private land ownership have been going all human history nearly, since we started stop being the hunters and gatherers. We started had a private land ownership, but now this new system, what they are calling like Putin and China, this is like new order. That's based on there's no private land ownership. Private land ownership stopped in Russia when they had communist revolution, and then later it became the China's path as well. But before that, China had all these 1,000 years of history. They had a private land ownership. Yeah. So this is my question. So now if we talk about the Eurasia continent, big part of the European continent is already the land is not owned by anyone because it's like government-owned land, and I have been working in 15 years in Russia, and I see there's no private ownership with the land, and it's different territory. I'm from Finland. We have a border, and then in Finland we have families who have private land ownership for 500, 600 years. So we saw the difference. There's absolutely big difference when the land, our earth, is owned by private people or the party. So this is my big question. So how this going to end? Kind of the view. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I guess the point I made earlier is about whether the world will accommodate two vastly different systems. I think that covers what you have explained. I mean, because at least in theory, that China follows the sort of communism and all that, and in that theory, they believe in collective public ownership. So if you talk about land ownership, there was no such thing in China, private land ownership. The government, the party controls all the land. The people can lease the ownership for up to 70 years. I take your points, but I think this is just the land ownership is just one of the bigger picture, as I explained earlier. That obviously China is doubling down on its own system, and it wants its own system to exist, coexist with the system that has been long accepted in the Western world. Now, it's unlikely we're going to see any new of understanding to be reached anytime soon. I think this is just the point that this kind of confrontation, the rivalry will continue until a new level of understanding are reached. And when is that going to happen? It really depends on how the economy will grow in China and the US. As Biden boasted, wrongly that like 4 years ago, there was so much talk about China's economy overtaking that of US. 2027, 2030, 2035. Now, 4 years later, nobody talk about that anymore. And Biden just sort of boasted last week, China will never. I don't agree with Biden. It really depends on how China's leadership handles its economic priorities this year and next. We should be able to see how, whether China can get itself out of the deflationary spiral.
Thank you so much. I think that's going to be one of the biggest stories of this year is the China economy. Yeah. We do need to wrap up, but just very briefly in 1 or 2 sentences each, one thing you hope will happen this year and whether you think it will happen.
You want to start, Michael?
Sure, thank you. Of course, I hope that the conflicts in Ukraine and Middle East will come to an end sooner rather than later. On a positive note, and as much as I find it distasteful to give any credit whatsoever to Mark Zuckerberg of the world or Elon Musk, I think that I'm hopeful that technology will continue to play a role, sometimes of going from bad to good. What I mean by that, enabling kids to distance learn, whether they're home from school because of wildfires in California or because of conflicts in Ukraine or the Middle East. I think it will also play a big role to counter what I said near the beginning of the growing roles and the audacity of these dictators. When you look at young kids in Iran, for instance, who have mobile phones in their hands and are able to record violations of human rights or get protesters together, that's really something. Very quickly, I can't let this opportunity pass, but that's also a good place for me to dovetail for a plug for my book, which is over there, Digital Pandemic. It's how technology went from bad to good during COVID. The shipment arrived in October, too late for my talk there, but we have a special FCC price of 150 Hong Kong dollars signed, and there's a great chapter in there about the media business and also how Singapore started off good, but didn't end up very good with COVID. So be happy to sign them for you. Thank you.
I hope to see the Chinese government put money directly into the hands of the consumers. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's something I like to see. And perhaps Jack Ma can make, a very high-profile speech again this year. I don't think that's going to happen. But.
Yeah, I think, that's the part I mentioned. I disagree with Juliana. I believe China is going to distribute, is going to bump the salaries and pension funds for ordinary folks. And second, what I want to see is that, China's president and the U.S. president will meet very soon. Even though it's a pity that our president did not take up the offer to go to Washington on January 20th, but I do believe that the two leaders are going to meet in the next 6 months, and I do hope a deal will be struck over the tariffs. I'm sure that China will have to accept some kind of hike in tariffs, but eventually both sides will reach a deal over the level of tariffs that both countries can find, can tolerate, and so that will ease tensions. But then again, there are going to be a lot of bumps in the years ahead, because as Jude Blanchett said yesterday at the Goldman Sachs conference, he made a quite interesting point that if you look at upcoming cabinets in the United States, like Donald Trump's cabinet, it seems Trump is the most sensible, most pragmatic person on China. That tells you how things are going to play out. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting year. Thank you all so much for coming today. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for coming. Apologies that we ran late. Just a reminder that events like this are unique to the FCC. If you are here as a guest today and are interested in perhaps joining the FCC, we are taking applications. You can talk to me, the staff, our President Lee Williamson here. We're all happy to help. And if you are a current member and you know someone who should be a member, please put an application in their hands. There's a $2,000 F&B credit in it for you if you succeed. So thank you all again and have a great day.
Thank you, Jett.